Hey guys, how's it going? Sam here, and today we're going to be looking at my painting process for my latest piece called Golem. This is going to be split into two parts just because of the length, so let's get started. So the first thing I want to talk about is the process. So from the start of the video you'll see that I've already started it, and I'm sorry I didn't get the initial process recorded. The main reason was because I created it in ZBrush, and ZBrush for me tends to be a tool I use for fun and practice. I very rarely create anything that I actually like in ZBrush, which is why I didn't record this, but as soon as this started going in a good direction, that's when I thought, well, you know what, I'm going to record the process. So I'm sorry I didn't get that. Hopefully there'll be enough information in this video to make up for it. So yeah, I started in ZBrush, I created all of the models in ZBrush, and I left out the things I felt would be relatively tricky to model and just easier in 2D. And that was mainly the hands and the vines. I figured both of those things I could probably achieve pretty well just by drawing them, so I left those out. The rest of it I did it in 3D. Now the reason I did it in 3D rather than 2D was because I wanted a dynamic pose that I felt would have been relatively tricky to create in 2D. Not impossible, but just a little bit trickier, and I want to improve my 3D skills in ZBrush, so I thought it was the perfect opportunity. I took the 3D model into Maya, and that's where I laid out each object to create the pose and set up a camera with some lighting and got the initial render that you saw at the start of the process. I then quickly sketched over it. The sketching process is really quick, really rough, just to get a general idea of where the vines are going to go, see if the composition works with the trees in the background and the foreground. And that's basically the start, that's the process that you'll see up to this point. So the main thing that I really wanted to focus on with this piece was the character pose. I felt like when you're doing pieces like this, when it's card art or an illustration with one character, I think the pose is really important. So I really wanted to get that right, and I actually did several different renders from different angles, and a few of them just weren't working, and I was really struggling for a while at the start. And as soon as I found this composition, I was really happy with it, and I kind of knew that this is the one I wanted to progress with. So to run through my thought processes with the pose, I wanted the shoulders really forward and one leg to be really far back to show the character moving forward, almost lunging forward or moving, really slowly from side to side. But I wanted a dynamic pose as if I've captured him during movement. I've achieved that with having a really strong angle in the shoulders and arms. So you can see everything is off center. The body's tilted down, the head is tilted opposite to that to make it appear more dynamic and give the head a more detail, focusing almost towards the camera but not quite. The arm in the front is quite large and really forward, which I think makes it more dynamic. The arm in the background is quite pushed back. I actually think I could probably push that back further looking at it now, just to push it back into the distance a little bit more with atmospheric perspective. But I wanted basically the dynamic of one leg lunging forward, and you can notice that the leg that is moving forward is his left leg and it's the right arm. So when you're drawing this kind of pose, it's always the opposites. So if you have his left arm forward, you'd have his right leg forward. And I find that's a really good way of keeping the character balanced. I've found working in 3D, creating these kind of poses, it's really easy to tell if a model is balanced or not. And by balanced, I mean it comes across with weight, as if it's a heavy object, it's not floating. I think that's relatively successful in this piece. So with that composition of the character lunging forward, I wanted it to be in the mid-ground of the painting. So I knew I was going to add these trees in the foreground to push the character back slightly, and have trees in the background to make sure there's something going on behind and give context of the scene that this creature's in. Now when creating a composition with trees like this in a forest, if you're going for a stylized piece like I have here, and you don't want those trees to be the focal point, you want them to be relatively simple. You don't want them to draw attention away from the character. So make sure that you're not going overly detailed with those designs, and make sure that the negative space is reading quite well and not interfering too much with the character. You can see even from my initial sketch, I've kept the darker trees surrounding the golem and then the trees behind him very light in value, so that doesn't draw attention away from the character itself. I find when I'm painting these kind of trees that the negative space is relatively hard to work out. It takes me a few attempts. You'll see me keep taking chunks away and adding them back in. I don't tend to do that in a drawing. I'll do that with just solid colour to give me a silhouette of the tree, and then I add details to that silhouette afterwards. I find for me that's the easiest way to work. Might not be the case for you, but definitely give it a go if you don't have a process for creating those kind of trees, because it focuses on the overall form rather than when you're drawing you can end up getting caught up in the marks that you're making rather than the overall shape. So I definitely recommend trying that if you haven't already. One of the main things I tend to focus on at the start of a painting are the value ranges. You can see when I'm working on this piece, I'm blocking in value and colour pretty much instantly, because I think it's one of the most important things to get right at the start. If you don't get that right at the start, you're going to be in trouble, and it's going to take a lot of fixing as you go on. So if you can get this bit right at the beginning, it will make your whole painting process easier. The main thought process that I have in regards to this is to think about your focal point and what you're going to do to draw the eye to that focal point. Now with values, they're relatively tricky because often you need to include colour in the decision as well, because you can draw attention to a certain object using colour, so saturation, or contrast in value, or maybe both. But remember that if you go too high in a value and get closer to white, you're going to lose saturation. So the closer you get to white, the less saturated colour is going to be. So sometimes if you know you're going to use a saturated colour, don't make sure it's not too bright. Remove some of the value, make it almost a mid-grey, because then that will allow you to use as much saturation as you want to draw the eye. Now I've done a bit of both in the head, which is what I want to be the main focal point. You've probably heard most people look at heads and hands, so obviously in this piece I want the head to be the focal point. Now I've achieved that to be the focal point by using colour and values. So the skull in the stone, I've used some of the lightest values in the piece, and then I've painted the mouth and the eyes in a very saturated green colour that isn't anywhere else on the golem except in the background, but not quite as bright. So it's almost a guaranteed way to draw the viewer's eye towards the head. You also notice as the piece goes on, the horns become more saturated and brighter than the rest of the piece. So the shoulder pauldron behind is darker in value than the horn, and that's because I want to draw the horn out and push the shoulder back. So that's one example of how I've used values in this piece. Another one, as the piece goes on, is I want to draw less attention to the leg in the foreground. Now as a painting, this leg and the hand in front are, if it was real, they would be the brightest objects in the scene. And I don't want that, because I don't want the hand to read first, I want the head to read. So the way to do that is to push the values back and make it less contrasted. So as I mentioned previously, contrast can be through colour or value, and I wanted to remove both. So if you look at the hand and the leg at the end of the painting, they don't have as much value range in contrast, and they are not as saturated as the head. So that's one way to stop something from drawing too much attention away. Hopefully that's kind of been achieved with this piece. There's always ways to improve it. Another thing I like to do with value ranges is in the character itself, you'll notice that the vines are quite dark compared to the wood. And I wanted value separation between the two objects to make sure they read properly. I've also done that with colour. Obviously the vines are green and the wood is brown. Separating the golem from the background, I've done exactly the same thing. The background is going to be a bright blue kind of colour, so you'll see that start to get brighter and brighter as the piece goes on. And the golem obviously is more warmer tones. I've used blue shadows, but there's a lot of brown, there's a lot of green on there, and the values tend to separate from the background by being either darker or lighter depending on what the background colour is. So some areas the background is darker and the golem's lighter, and vice versa depending on the situation. So make sure when you're working on your values you're always thinking about how is it reading. Do you want to push something into the background or do you want to pull it into the foreground? And make sure you use the appropriate value to do so. So when I've mentioned this in other videos about local values, a local value is, let's say you've got a dark grey tree in the background. If I then went and took a very light grey as the highlights on that tree, that's very contrasted and you're going to draw attention to that highlight. So local values is a value that's very close to the original colour. So if you've got a dark grey tree, use a grey similar to that or a different colour that's similar in value to that grey to add a highlight. And that's what I've done in the background trees. As you can see, there's detail there but not too much to draw the eye away from it. So when you look at it you can see that there is a form, a 3D form where light is hitting a certain part of the tree and not others. It's not flat, but it's not drawing too much attention. As I was designing this character in ZBrush, I was obviously thinking about the initial character design, which you haven't really seen being produced in this video, so I wanted to explain it. I wanted to go for an asymmetrical design, so the shoulders, because they're made of wood, are going to be different shapes from one another. So I've pushed one up and pulled one down. The arms are the same, the wood on each arm is like the arm protection. Are a little bit different. The hands, I've gone with very different poses in each hand, so I didn't want those to be too similar. Rock is breaking away, all the vines are different shapes. It lends itself to being an asymmetrical design, suggests that it's natural and it's not man-made, as man-made materials tend to be very symmetrical. We tend to make things, perfectly. That's what we try to do. So when you see something like this, it almost feels like it's grown from the earth, which is exactly what I wanted it to be. When I considered colour, I knew I'd be doing an illustration like this, so I could have done the whole character in wood, or I could have done the whole character in stone, but I really like the contrast. So when it came to deciding what parts were going to be what, I knew I wanted separation between the shoulders and the chest, and I knew I wanted separation between the hands and the arms, and the best way to do that is to use two different materials. Now the two materials are quite similar when you paint them actually, so the specular doesn't change too much, so it's actually quite an easy way to achieve it. Stone and wood I think work really well together to create a harmonious design, and I think it's come away quite well in this piece. I wanted to have vines growing through the wood and almost being the underneath that he's protecting, as if the vines, if you imagine cutting a vine with a sword, it's a lot easier than trying to cut the wood. So that's why I like the idea of the wood being his armour and the vines being the wild side of his body that's expanding and growing, which is why it's breaking through some of the armour in places, and breaking the silhouette of the character. That's another thing that I had to consider with the design, is the silhouette. And I started off this character by producing a completely symmetrical front-on design. I find that's really useful to start an initial design process because you're not worrying too much about perspective or composition. You're focusing purely on the character design. So if you're struggling to design something while still trying to keep up with the anatomy and the perspective, try drawing it flat on. It won't look as good, but it will give you a good idea of the actual design of the character that you need to work out. If you're a little bit worried about working in colour, I completely understand. I've been there myself. I've only just started becoming confident with colour, and it's because I follow a few simple rules. Keep it really simple. Don't try to use too many colours. I would suggest starting off with 2 colours. You can start to add more in after that once the piece is going well, but start off with 2. And always consider your light source colour and your shadow colour. They tend to contrast. So if you're going to use a very warm light, then use a cool shadow. So I've kind of done that in this piece. The browns that are getting a lot of light are relatively warm, and I've countered that with a very purple blue shadow on the character. Always try to remember to localize your colors. So in a scene you're going to have one dominant color. In this scene it's blue, so my entire scene is quite cold. Now if I use too many very saturated warm tones, it's going to be jarring, it's going to stand out too much. Now obviously this is a slightly cartoony piece, so I have pushed the browns a little warmer than you might in a realistic image, but I still haven't pushed them too far. If I went really saturated with those browns, they wouldn't look like they sit in the environment. So a simple way to remember it is, imagine you're painting with a real brush, and every time you want to choose a colour, it's got a little bit of your dominant colour left on the brush. So my dominant colour is blue. I'm going to have a little bit of blue on my brush no matter what colour I try to mix. So if I want to make a white, it's going to be a slightly blue white. So I hope that makes sense. So if you follow those simple ideas, start with 2 colours, keep it really simple. In Photoshop you can always edit it anyway, so don't be scared of it, just give it a go, see how you get on. So I think that will probably do it for this video. I hope you've enjoyed this. I've tried to keep the information quite factual, quite to the point. I'm sorry if it's a little bit dry and a little bit boring, but I would love to hear your feedback on this, and there's going to be another video showing me finishing this piece, and I'll probably talk about some ideas around how to push a painting to a final stage, how to know when it's done, how to polish it, that final bit. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you struggle with in a painting, and if I've covered any of those points. If there's something you've seen me paint in this video that you'd like me to explain in further detail, please let me know in a comment. If you can do that within the next week, that'd be amazing, so that's probably when I'm going to record the audio for the next piece. And I hope you've enjoyed it. Please subscribe if you haven't. It lets me know how well the channel is doing, and if I should carry on spending time to produce these videos. And let me know if there's any video ideas that you want me to work on in the future. So thank you guys for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.